Welcome, system thinkers. You're watching The Question. I'm your host, Ben Callahan, and each week I invite a new co-host to join us and help facilitate a deep dive into design systems. This episode of The Question is sponsored by Zeroheight and Sparkbox, and we're so glad you're here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join me for this episode's deep dive. My name is Ben Callahan. I'm a design system researcher, writer, speaker, coach, and consultant. But most of all, I'm a curious guy. And that's precisely what led me to create The Question. Every week, a new co-host and I will ask you a few questions about a very specific design system-related topic. You'll have 48 hours to answer, and everyone who does is invited to join the deep dive. Each week is kind of like a mini research project on a very niche design system topic. This only works if we all stay in learning mode. Before I introduce my co-host for this week, I just want to say a big thank you to Zeroheight and Sparkbox for sponsoring this episode. Zeroheight is the end-to-end design system management platform, the place your team can document, deliver, measure, and evolve your design system. Book a demo or learn more at zeroheight.com. Sparkbox partners with complex organizations to create user-driven digital experiences, including world-class design systems. Learn more at sparkbox.com/thequestion. This week, I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Dan Mall. Dan is a family man, a designer, a teacher, a consultant, a photographer, an author, among many other things. He's been helping teams work more systematically for a long time now, and I'm excited to have him joining this week to answer the question, how much of a rascal are you? Here we go. So the question this week was based on, Dan and I had a call where we were just batting around a bunch of ideas. And one of the things that he's been thinking about, he shared in this article, how much of a rascal are you? And the quote that I pulled in here says, how do you change something if you don't have the approval to do it? You do it anyway. But don't tell anyone you're doing it. Only share the results when your work is done. So that's sort of a very strong opinion on how one person may approach this. So with that, Dan and I came up with these two questions. Is it okay to break your organization's existing rules and policies in an attempt to establish a design system? So that's straight up yes or no. I know some of you really wanted there to be a maybe, but I did not give you that option. And then after that, as a follow-up, based on that answer, tell us a story about a time when you broke a rule or where you chose to adhere, and what was the result of that? And so that's kind of the data that we have gathered, and you can see the quick breakdown on that quantitative question. Is it okay to break your organization's existing rules? And we have a lot of rule breakers in this group, it looks like. So, and a smaller number of folks who said no. And so I just want to open it up. Dan, tell me sort of high level, like what did you take away from reading through this?
Yeah, so two things I'll share. A lot of things. The stories were great. I loved reading through those, and I know we're going to dive into that today. Two things that I'll share that kind of jumped out at me. One is that, and this is both through my work with other folks, but also even just directly through these questions. Whenever I'm working with a team and asking these kinds of questions, we're going over these kinds of topics, it very quickly presses on identity. It very quickly presses on who do you believe you are in things like this. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and I hope we get into the discussion about, is like, there are some people who want to see themselves as rule breakers, whether or not they are. You know, I think I'm one of those people. I'm like, I don't know if I'm a rule follower, but I like thinking of myself as a maverick. I like thinking of myself as like somebody who's like, yeah, caution to the wind. I'm like, I'm going to do the thing that's right, even though if it goes against the grain. It's an appealing idea. We glorify it in movies and things like that. And so I think there's some like, one thing I'm curious about is like how many people want to see themselves as rule followers and so answered yes, or rule breakers and so answered yes versus actually are. So that's one thing is the identity. And then the other thing that kind of jumped out at me, and it was in a couple of the responses, it was the idea that came up that a lot of people said, I would rather ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. Mm-hmm. I was like, okay. And I have some resistance to that idea because that often comes up related to this topic. And the resistance that I have to it is I don't like asking for forgiveness when I don't think I've done anything wrong. And so even the idea of, I'd rather ask for forgiveness is like, well, you're sort of saying that you did something wrong, but did you? And I think that's what I'd love to discuss with all of you today is like, is it actually wrong? And how do we define that? How do we set the culture of things that are right or wrong, especially as it relates to design system work, where there's the last thing I'll say is in design system work, for a lot of teams, you're actually setting rules, right? Like a lot of people are drawn to design system work because of creating standards and creating rules for others to follow, mostly well-intentioned. And so is it okay to do something wrong in order to be able to set ways to do it right? There's a little bit of an irony or a tension in that. So those are things that I was very curious to kind of read through the comments that kind of jumped out. And I would love to hear what folks here think about.
Ben, I bet you could have put money that I was going to raise my hand first. Dan, it is so nice to meet you in real life. Longtime fan. It's kind of like meeting a Beatle. I don't know, but it's just really nice to be with you here today. I have a lot of feelings. And I think that when we think about this idea of being a rascal, when I love that word, you also kind of have to think about what your role is within your organization. If you are going to create meaningful change, it can't just be like change, it has to be lasting change. So how are you going to do these things, not just so that you can make the change you need to do your job, but that it endures? And I think that the change you need to make radically depends on your positioning within your org, whether that's like, hey, I need to, adjust my system architecture in Figma, or I need to create some serious relationships, bipartisan relationships across my org in order to increase system adoption. That's really going to impact how you behave in this. If you're high enough up there, you can't ask for forgiveness because you're going to be like, you can't ask for your job back when they're like, you can't behave this way. So I think that there's a spectrum of responsibility that comes with how we create change.
I love that. Amy, do you have a thought there?
When it comes to rule breaking, my mind splits into like two categories. One of them is just rule breaking because you want to be a maverick. Sure, that's your brand. But then there's sort of like educated rule breaking, where you start talking to people across the org and they realize there really is a problem. Nobody wants to own up to solve it. Maybe it's not on the roadmap, whatever, but you're going to solve it. And that means breaking a few rules. So you're doing it with the best intentions of the organization.
Yeah, I also agree with that sentiment. I just want to echo that I think I definitely don't see myself as a rule breaker. I'm actually very much normally as a rule follower, but I've had to most oftentimes working in systems push myself to break all of the rules and to get uncomfortable by doing things people have either asked me not to do or have not asked me to do. And I think it just goes with this idea of, good intent. And I'm somebody who I assume good intent of everybody that I'm working with, and I expect the same from others. And so I try to approach my conversations with that, where I can just say like, hey, this is a really hefty problem to solve. And even if you don't agree with my approach here, like this is what I'm trying to illustrate. And especially within the design world, I think having something to illustrate to people by doing the thing and then showing it to them creates healthier conversation and gets to a solution much faster, or at least identifies the problem that you think is, really worth going after and solving much faster.
I think you hit on something really important, and that is, if we're talking about breaking rules and they're not working for you, if you're in design system management, and I said this last week in the session, my full-time job is influencer. How are you influencing change? Because you're going to need those relationships down the line. You can't just be pissing people off in order to get the things done. How are you bringing them along in your journey? It might not have a perfect success rate, but you're going to need those people later on, period. So yeah, you got to influence to create the change, maybe not just blow everything up.
I just want to throw a question out there to the question, which is, what if the organization you work for has rules that are fragile or are already broken, contradictory perhaps? And I mean, I think a lot of design system efforts find themselves trying to put the pieces together and figuring out what the rules maybe should be. And I think that can be a very complicated and a very politically heated part of the process.
Dealing with this a lot now too. Like, we're building a system with multiple brands that have conflicting goals. Fundamentally, it's creating a lot of misalignment within the system. And I think it's more about surfacing that misalignment and letting people know, like, hey, we're getting all these different directions. And if we're clearly able to articulate what we're seeing that's causing us to have to break rules in one place or another, like you're always going to break a rule if it's conflicting. We've just had more success with being extremely explicit to our leadership about our understanding of the goals, how they're conflicting, and then the result of those conflicting goals. And that's when they've been able to look at it and say like, oh, I see why now there's churn and there's confusion.
Yeah, those 2 points I think are the ones that resonate really strongly with me, which is that the journey of systems work exposes all of the stuff that's broken. I mean, when you're looking around trying to sort of discover the best practices, you see all of the bad stuff that's going on, all the unhealth. And so I think that journey, has to be about identifying those things and then bringing, as Molly said, being an influencer, right? Like bringing those folks along on the journey of sort of understanding how a better approach might work.
I'll share a prompt here for everybody. I think, Ben, when you and I were kind of first prepping in this, I think I shared this with you. I'll tell you the situation that made me ask someone, how much of a rascal are you? Right. And I'd be curious to see what each of you would do in this situation. Maybe you've faced this situation before. So I was working with a team and they had no design system. So we were standing it up from scratch. It wasn't like we were improving anything. It was like, starting from scratch. So I was like, okay, what's one of the first things that we do is we need a repo for the new design system. We need a repository to put the code in. So I said, all right, let's make a repository. And they went, okay, we'll figure out how to do that. So they did some due diligence, came back the next day and said, well, we're not allowed to create a repo because that has to go through our IT department. And that's going to take about 6 to 8 weeks for that to happen. And so we were blocked, right? Because we had done all the other things around it. And like, that was one of the things that was like, well, we need that in order to move forward on some part of this journey. And they said, well, what do we do? And I said, well, how much of a rascal are you? Right? Because the technical nature of that problem is not difficult. All of us here, like right now, I could open GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever, and I could create a repo right now, and it would take 30 seconds to do. So it's not a technical hurdle. It is an organizational, political hurdle that probably was put in place for some good reasons, right? Some amount of years ago. And perhaps that was the only precedent where some team needed to create a repo and something went wrong. And so they have this protocol in place. So we need this in order to do our work. It's going to take 6 to 12 weeks for someone else to make the repo for us, which probably means it's probably somewhere from 18 to 24 weeks. In reality, it's like to make a repo. That's it. Not even to put anything in it, not even just to make a repo. So the question is, which one of you would make the repo? Would you make it? Would you just stand it up? Or would you go like, all right, well, I guess we're on hold for 6 to 12 weeks or, 18 to 24 weeks?
I would absolutely make the repo.
Yeah. I work for the government. Of course I would make the repo.
This is
so, and I think the other part of that sentence is, which one of you would make the repo? And probably good reasons to make the repo. And what repercussions would you face because of that? Because I think that's the other side of that question is like, there's going to be some penalty to that somewhere, right? And that penalty could be, the equivalent of getting your wrist slapped, or it could be, well, we're going to have a conversation with someone that might open some new doors, but that it's just going to be annoying and difficult to do. So there's some consequence to that happening. So maybe, as you all are answering that, it's like, what repercussions do you think you would face? And then, Jesse, to Jesse's comment in the chat, what repercussions would you be willing to face? Even though they're coming, you're like, the juice is worth the squeeze on this one. Like, I'm happy to do it. I'll share one quick story before that. My wife is the kind of person where growing up, she would always say like I would just do things that I knew I was going to get in trouble for because I knew I could face the consequences. Right. So there's some of that stuff is like, I know I could face the consequences. I'll just do it. And then some of it is like, oh, those consequences are going to suck. So I don't know if I want to do this. So I'd be curious to hear from you all, like at your organizations or in other places that you've worked maybe prior, what repercussions would you have faced to do things like making the repo or, creating something that you actually don't have the permission to do? And would it be worth it for you to actually do that? Maybe you can talk about why or why not.
Yeah. Who's got a story of repercussions? Christy?
Of course I do. I do. I've done this since the beginning of my career. I think I've actually always been like this my whole life too. I think when you're waiting for permission to do what you feel is right or what you are passionate about, you're probably never going to get that permission. I have found that it just doesn't happen. So I'm the one who kind of wrote this, that someone asked, learn how to do this. But where I moved forward by attaching a little bit of design system to every user story. So my last position, there wasn't a design system. And every time we added a feature, the engineers were just engineering it from scratch, which is everyone's dream, right? So production was super, super slow. The engineers really wanted a design system and a real one. And I think the previous designer had tried, but she had only read Atomic Design and didn't really understand how design systems worked. So what we did is I had my lead designer set aside 20% of their time a day to work on creating the fundamentals of the design system and establishing some rules, and then working with the engineers directly to see whatever feature was coming out that we could attach a little bit of design system to and change the structure of the site slowly. It was very successful. I don't think anyone even noticed except for our two teams, and a little bit of marketing too, considering they are using components. But yeah, I think I haven't necessarily dealt with repercussions. I think the most repercussions I've ever dealt with would probably be someone telling me that I'm wasting my time and that I should be focused on something else. But I have found that in the long run, that time was not wasted, in my opinion.
Yeah, I love that story of sort of a little bit from each person over the course of a few months gets you actually quite a bit, and so that's a great success story. Ness, what's on your mind?
Hey, it's probably less about repercussions, but I feel like the biggest repercussion in terms of a few things that I've done has been the fact that after I've done something, I become the sole owner of that thing. It might not be a negative thing, but sometimes maybe you don't want to be the only person looking after that thing. So I saw a story very similar to one of my recent ones, which was the last company I was at. We had a sketch license and we didn't have any version control, and we were wanting to spin up a design system. And I was lucky enough to have a head of product who was on my side who just handed me his credit card and said, have at it, which was, quite good to have. But as a result, we built the design system in Figma, then slowly started onboarding designers to make sure everybody was comfortable moving over. And it got to the point where we had to transition over to Figma from Sketch, which it was a 50 designers in the company, right? So it wasn't exactly the smoothest transition. And I don't think our design ops team were very, very happy with me either. But I feel like it's worth making those changes if you know they're going to have a beneficial impact on the business, whether it be purely from a design system standpoint or even just from a design standpoint. In that use case, like Figma just made way more sense for that business at scale. So, I mean, I've never been one to shy away from breaking the rules if I know it's going to be better in the long run.
I feel like that this was a theme for sure. Like, I would guess that, I don't know if Figma did like an underground campaign to try and get individual designers to do this, but there were so many stories. In fact, the first time I had AI summarize the yeses, it came out with the idea that you can break the rules if you need to get Figma in your organization. I mean, that was one of the summary points. So I was just thinking, if I'm going to ever build a tool, one of the things I'm going to do is think about this as an avenue for growth, right? Molly, what are you thinking?
Well, this isn't a repercussions story, but going back to the situation and what would you do, I think that before it's like, do you do it or do you not do it? There's a seek to understand moment. Why is this in place? What is this serving? Who's in charge? Why was this set up? And then one, looking to see if you can influence that. Previously, before I was at CarMax, I was in financial services doing systems, brand systems and design systems. And oftentimes there's severe legal risk. to doing things on your own. And there were often barriers to actually being able to doing it. So it's okay, what do we do in the interim? And one, if you needed a design system, you knew you needed a design system and there wasn't a repo, this was probably a question you should have asked before you got this far. But that's, if you're working client side and you're scoping, that should be one of the first things you ask.
I love that, like, seek to understand moment. Like what would we put? So obviously the repercussions are like one factor there, but like, is that just a matter of like weighing the potential benefit with the potential repercussions? Is that all that is?
Possibly.
We could probably make a little matrix of like how to make that decision,
Yeah, I just had a real world repercussion for going forward with setting up a repo. So I think the repercussion is you'll probably have to move it at some point in the future. So I've had this experience where we just moved forward, we set things up, and then for a number of reasons, infrastructure maybe finally got around to considering, okay, what is this new repo that the design system team is proposing? How does it fit into our larger architecture? Or other things like acquisitions, and then infrastructure has to do that whole process again. It's like, how do we restructure all of our repos? I think that's a completely acceptable repercussion. I'm totally fine with unblocking our team so they continue to make progress with the knowledge that, maybe we'll have to, we're creating a little bit more work for ourselves in the future, and we'll have to move things and shift things around at some point, but that's totally acceptable to me.
Yeah, a little debt, maybe, a little tech debt or whatever, if that's could be definitely worth it. Elise.
Yeah, I wanted to share something that actually just happened in our front-end guild last week. So I just started on a new team. We're relatively small, and one of the things that came up in all of my interviews that I was doing was like, if there's anything that needs to happen that's more than like a day or two of a developer's time that like touches like all of engineering, right? Like we just don't. We're like, that's too big. We're moving too fast. We're we're trying to ship too much. And in front end guild, we were kind of complaining. They were complaining about it, and they were like, "We can't, get resources. Like these things we're not going to be able to do these kind of things." And I was talking to our SVP of engineering, and he was like, "They've never asked for resources," and that's been on my mind since you asked this on Monday, because we often are like, oh, we have to go behind, go around, or like these things aren't going to happen, or, and then we don't actually go and figure out, how do I actually take this to somebody? How do I actually go and say, hey, we want this to happen, and here's what we think the scope is, and I will commit my time, right? I think often, and maybe this isn't true for all of your design teams, but I've seen this a lot, especially with engineering. It's like, well, if the business will like give us time to do all of this tech debt, if they will just like think that it's important, maybe one of these days we'll like finally be able to get around to it. But hearing directly from our SVP of like, they can just come give me a proposal. And if that disrupts other people, like maybe we're going to agree that it's worth it. So just fresh on my mind about asking for permission to be rascally, I guess.
Yeah, that's a nice little sort of compromise, right? Jesse?
I was thinking a lot about this. I don't see myself as a rule breaker. I don't really like that moniker. I also feel like, if you're building, if your goal is, and I think this is a lot of the goals of design systems is, you're building consensus. I feel like sometimes this can fight against you if you kind of take that route. That being said, I know I joked about it, but I work in the government. And, Dan, when you said, 6 weeks to create a repo, I was like, yeah, that sounds very normal here. I just had a 2-month wait for a signature on a $0 contract with the U.S. Digital Response. So I totally understand that. And so it reminded me, I've been reading this book, Recoding America by Jenny Palka. She started Code for America. And she's got one of the chapters in the book is paperwork favors the powerful. And so what's interesting about that is that, there are some systems, especially in large organizations, where there's like this calcified system that needs innovation, right? And sometimes the people who have some modicum of power need to help challenge those problematic rules. And again, I'll just from my own experience, we're trying to do audits and interface audits and really just bring these best practices and challenge some of the ways things have been done. And there, what we're finding in a lot of the research that we're doing is you have designers that are saying, we've been saying this all along. It's nice to have somebody come and give us essentially the firepower to essentially challenge these rules. So I just thought that perspective was helpful. One other thing that I think is worth reading, if you've never read it before, Michael Lopp, who's an engineer, an engineering lead at Apple, wrote an article called Stables and Volatiles. And it's such a good read. It's focused on engineering, but it really talks about the types of people. And there are some people in organizations who are the volatiles, who are very much focused on, they prefer to define strategy rather than to follow it. They, are focused on shipping and making sure that we get things done. They're not as concerned about process. Stables, though, really care about the longevity of systems and setting up processes and stuff like that. So might be a good way to help think about this as well.
Hey everybody, there's still a lot of great content left in this episode, but let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors.
How much time are you spending wrangling all the aspects of your design system? Trying to create a unified experience with your UI libraries, your code resources, your design tokens? You need a platform that makes managing a design system easier, not a chore. So zeroheight is the design system management platform that centralizes everything, including your documentation. And this year, we've rolled out some game-changing features that make zeroheight even more powerful. First up, we have the adoption tab, which gives you real-time insights into how your design system is actually being used. So you can hook it up directly to your code repos and NPM packages, and it will not only make sure that everyone is using your latest packages, but it'll also give you insights into component usage as well. Finally, you can prove real design system ROI. And then there's our brand new API as well. In a few minutes, you can create your own Figma plugin or API chatbot to bring your documentation to the places that your team is actually searching for it. If you're looking to make design system management seamless and efficient, what are you waiting for? Try zeroheight for free today by heading to zeroheight.com and use the offer code QUESTION to get a free 90-day trial. That's zeroheight.com and the offer code is QUESTION. Enjoy the show.
For the last 16 years, Ben and I have both been business partners and friends in our company Sparkbox, which is always aimed to build a better web. In the beginning, that was two software engineers coming together believing there was a better way to do things. What Sparkbox evolved into is a complete team that includes user experience, design, engineering, and plenty of consulting and strategy. About 10 years ago, we dove headfirst into design systems, helping some of the world's largest companies and universities and even tons of small businesses to help realize the efficiency and promise of what design systems can bring. I continue to be in awe of what Ben learns and shares in this community. If you need strategic or tactical help with your design system, swing by sparkbox.com and reach out. We'd love to partner with you and your team. Have a great day. Enjoy the show.
Yeah, that's awesome, Jesse. I threw a link to that in the resources section. And what you're saying kind of gets at some of the cultural stuff, actually. And some of our work is with older organizations that are not sort of digital first companies. And so in those companies, they're tending to live more on this left side of this model over on the next screen over here. And if they're in this control section where they're like based on hierarchy and they really are focused on doing things right. They have a process defined for everything. They're sort of rule followers. They're not the rascals. A lot of times they know that that's also going to limit their innovation in some way. And so the way they go about that, at least what I've seen, is they develop these little teams that are, R&D groups or innovation teams, and they operate in the top right, which is this creative disruption thing. And so they essentially give license to a small subgroup of their organization to go and break the rules and find the things that are going to work and then loop that back into the org in some way, right? So I'm thinking about this too culturally, like, can the system do both of those things, right? Can you be the part of the organization that's saying, here's the process, here's the cohesive way we're going to work on product, but also we want to leave space for innovation and for, for thinking outside of our design system box, So how do we do that? How do we enable both of those?
I put this one in the chat, but one of the things that's been interesting listening to you all is everything that has been said could be said by a consumer to our design systems. Like it strives, it prevents innovation, or it takes too long, or anything that's said, a consumer would say about our design system. So how can we as design system leaders break organization rules when at the same time preaching don't break our guidance or don't ignore our rules to our consumers? Surely we're just a bunch of hypocrites, and maybe that's the way we have to do it. But it's an interesting thing, and one of the things that comes to mind is those policies and rules that the organisation has in place. They're made not to be broken. They don't really allow much room for that, depending on the organisation. There are some design system teams that, like I think just stole my Pinterest, they have a page where it's like, if you are going to break our rules, because we know you will, people break rules, here's the best way to break our rules. And so it's an interesting thing about how can we say one thing and do the other ourselves.
I love that. And Daniel, you were not alone in that sentiment. So almost all of the folks who answered no, and I pulled some summaries out here, there was definitely a theme of that. How do we say that it's okay to break rules now if we're going to expect people to follow rules later when they're our rules, and I think that the sentiment was that you risk product teams not adopting and losing trust. Help you is not applicable when teams are on different timelines and priorities. I think to assume change can only be done by you is an arrogant and often costly mistake. Right. So are we being arrogant with this idea of the rules need broken, I'm the one that has to do it, So there's a lot of food for thought around on the negative side of this as well. Amy, what's on your mind?
I've been thinking a lot about the 4 types quadrant graph that you have, Ben. There's the avoid risk versus disrupt everything. And there's somewhere in the middle. And sometimes I come back to, why were you hired in the first place? Did they just want a warm body to fill a seat? Do they want people to fit into their maximum number of sprint velocity points per whatever? Or did they hire you because you had a skill that nobody else had? Did they hire you because you are going to contribute something and you're going to stretch them a little? And I think that one of my questions when I join an organization is, what do you want? Do you want me? Do you want my skill base? Do you want what I'm going to bring to your team? Because if so, it will stretch and challenge you, but hopefully in the way that your organization, your leadership wanted.
That's a great point. Yeah. Why are you here? And especially as a systems person, why are you here? I do think a lot of folks find themselves working on the system and maybe that wasn't why they were hired. They kind of fall into that role. So that's another side to that. But Michael, what are you thinking about?
I just want to respond to Daniel. I think breaking rules for both parties is totally fine if there is a good reason for it, right? Why are we breaking the rules to begin with? Because we need to get something done. If a product team isn't going to use a design system and they're going to break from it, what's the reason? There might be a really good reason for it. And the design system team can understand that reason and bring it back into the system. So I think we're not breaking rules for the sake of breaking rules, but we're doing it because we need to accelerate something.
No, I agree. And I think this is where things like the community model of an organization supports that rule breaking is, hey, we know our design system doesn't do all the things you need to do in your product team. Here's some flexibility for you to break some rules, but in a kind of a controlled environment. So we know what rules you've broken. And at some point we can re-add it to the organization design system. So the whole feedback loop needs to be there. It doesn't need to be everyone breaking rules left, right, and center. And no one knows why you've done it. That's a very different environment to rule breaking than pushing innovation forward for everybody.
Dan, what are you hearing here? Is anybody changing your mind?
I don't know if I have my own opinion about it. So there's not a lot, my mind is constantly changing, or it's constantly not. I don't know, one version of that. I think one of the things that it makes me think about is, the role of a design system team. I have this article that I've been drafting for the last couple of weeks. It's nowhere near finished, but I'm just like working out my thoughts on it. And it's the idea that design standards aren't the same thing all the time as design systems. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So is the role of your design system to establish and reinforce standards? Or is it not? Because I've worked with design system teams that, yes, that is true. And I've worked with design system teams where that's not true. It's the brand standards team or whatever, some other team that actually sets the standards, and the design system teams are the ones to codify that and to help enable that. So I think the role question that a lot of you brought up, I think is really poignant in that the role, it might not be the role to help set the rules. It also might be the role to help set the rules. And I think that's got to be stated. That's got to be established. One of the things the last thing I'll say is it reminds me of a couple of years ago when the word selfie was added to the dictionary. People flipped out, right? People are like, wait, we can't add words to the dictionary. That's not how that works. And it's because how people thought the dictionary works is there's some small committee somewhere that like it says like what is a word and what is not a word. And then they write the dictionary and then everybody uses the dictionary. And it's like, that's not what the dictionary is. The dictionary is a cultural document. It basically says all these words that have entered our vocabulary, we're going to add them so that we are codifying our culture. And as our culture evolves, we are going to update the dictionary in order to keep track of that. That's a very different way of thinking about it. And I thought that was like one-to-one with design systems. A lot of people think design systems are, we write the rules and then people follow the rules. And then other folks are like, no, I think things happen at our company, and the job of a design system team is to then collect those things and say, okay, this is the stuff that's happening. And as new things happen, okay, we fold those into the system because our culture is changing. So it made me think about that dichotomy. And I think I've met a lot of people that have very staunchly different opinions about that. And that's why it's so culturally different depending on what organization you work at. So this conversation has reminded me of that. I'm fascinated by it. And I love hearing all the different viewpoints that everybody has about it.
I love that, Dan, that it's living, that it is more about discovering what the culture needs at a given time than it is about saying you should behave in a certain way. That's awesome. Christy.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, but different. I don't think that breaking the rules is about breaking the rules, right? Like, I think that you have to know the rules first before you can break them. And using wisdom to know that like this is going to be better. It's going to be better for the other teams. And I'm going to make sure that it is by speaking to everyone and being an influencer and an advocate. But yeah, I think rules are kind of vague and put in place because someone thought this is the best way to go, but they're not necessarily here to stay for forever. So I think, it's just using wisdom and knowing, having followed the rules previously and knowing, hey, I know this is a rule, but I see a benefit in maybe bending it or breaking it by doing this instead.
I was actually going to loop back to just the comment on having designers and product teams sort of breaking the rules. And I guess when I come from it from a perspective of, so this year, the company I work at did a rebrand. And as part of that, we had a really strict timeline. And so we actually had to be quite dictatorial in a lot of ways. And I feel like that's almost maybe a bit of negativity towards our team that we're now trying to fix. So I think maybe there's something to say about like taking a step back and making sure that like whatever you're doing within a design system is like, there has to be a line at which you stop and say, yeah, we do set the rules, but actually things need to change, because all of a sudden now we're finding that people are, diverging from the system and coming back to us, and we've not got the processes to support those changes as well. So I think it's really important to know as the rule breakers ourselves that, product teams are going to continue to break the rules, but are they really breaking the rules if the system isn't serving their needs? They're actually just trying to find other solutions, which is exactly why we broke the rules to build a system in the first place, right? So, it's my thoughts on that.
Awesome. Zach, what's going on?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. And so for context, we're in an org where we can do pretty much whatever we want, and we're the ones setting the path. But we're doing a lot of token work right now. And we ran across the concept of adaptable versus durable tokens, right? I forget who wrote the article, but it was a really good article. And I kind of see the rules that we're creating for our system like that. There are adaptable versus durable rules. Like, we really need you to follow our accessibility guidelines, but in these other areas, maybe it's not so important to strictly adhere to everything we tell you. I'm sure you have your reasons. And to the dictator comment, I've worked with design systems that were more dictatorship, and it's just not fun. And your customers get upset with you often. So allowing them to break the rules in a safe fashion, I find, has been the best way to go about this.
That's awesome. Like a spectrum of strict adherence to more flexibility. That's cool. Jesse?
Just going back to my previous point about like calcified systems, I wonder if healthy contribution guidelines help alleviate some of these pressures. So like when you think of the scenarios, like to Dan's original question, a 6-week requirement for a repo feels oppressive. And I think most sane people would say, I don't understand a world where that makes sense, right? And yet it happens. And why? What are the reasons why a rule like that would come into place? And so I think part of this is, especially for us as developers of systems, how do we create a system that is, and I know several of you have mentioned this about, if you're going to break rules, here's how to do it in a way that's like, healthy or beneficial. I was talking with, I forget who I was talking with, but somebody had this really great pattern in their design system where if they hadn't had the chance yet to codify a component or a pattern into their design system, they would have like community. There was almost like recipes where they would still be able to like show it off, but they hadn't yet been able to do the work of cleaning it up and abstracting it or something like that. So having things like that, which are almost like escape valves or like these systems for handling the rule breakers or the scenarios where people would feel that pressure of needing to break the rules. I wonder if we can improv some of those kinds of things and allow for those kinds of controls that might make our systems a little bit more flexible. It's always the places where you don't anticipate that people go, but there's that one thing.
Yeah. What are other ways people are making their systems more flexible to allow for this kind of thing? Anybody?
A lot of hard work, and sometimes not as successful as we want it to be.
Dan, do you have insight there?
I'm working with a team right now where they have come up with a very counterintuitive way to create more flexibility that I thought was just like genius. I think how a lot of people think about flexibility, specifically as it relates to a design system, is they think about things like composability. Like, okay, if we're not so specific and instead we give people the Legos, right? We give them the atoms and we give them the molecule and they can come up with their own organisms and things like that. I think that's how a lot of us think about flexibility is we'll just give people the ingredients and then they can come up with their own dishes. And a lot of times that backfires. I've seen that backfire more times than it's actually worked because now you have to give even more guidance about how to use the ingredients in order to work in the so it's like I have very rarely seen that work well. So what the team that I'm working with actually did was they said, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with actually even more strict and specific components where the scope of them is limited. And it's like kind of an it's not an anti-pattern. That's the wrong way to describe it. It's counter to what I think most people think about design systems, where most people think about design systems as generic things that have broad applicable use, right? A button, a card, right? It's a generic container that everyone can use and be able to fill in all of the different things. And this team said, we're going to make things that are very, very specific and actually have a very limited use case. Still at scale, right? So it's not a one-off. It's like a lot of teams can use this, but they can use it in a very specific way so that we don't have to write a lot of guidance around it. It is one of those things that you either use it and when you use it, it's like perfect for you, or you don't use it and it's not perfect for you and you go and build your own thing, which is what they would have done anyway. So we're not hurting anyone by doing it. We're actually saving a few people some time, the people who really need that thing done in that way. And it's like, it was one of the only times where I've seen receiving teams, product teams who implementing teams look at a thing and be very polarized by it and go like, yep, we could use that right away, right now. And it would save us 2 weeks, or nah, we'll go build our own. And like, not a lot of room in the middle, not a lot of discussion around it, not a lot of like, well, I mean, if it had this other thing, maybe you could work with us. And, and that's where a lot of teams get into hot water. And instead they sort of polarized the implementing teams, and it worked like a charm. Really freed up that team to go like, oh, that's what you do. You give us a handful of things and we'll still build all the rest. Cool. We'll work with you. And I thought it was a really great strategy and a very counterintuitive way to solve a problem that I'm like, that goes in the tool belt now.
I identify a lot with that approach. Being an org that has 35 plus product teams that we have a single system approach for. And I'm curious with that approach, how the stakeholders feel about that when you are attempting to measure adoption or prove ROI.
So I'll give the example of Eventbrite. I worked with Eventbrite last year. I'm so proud that they won a design system award with the zeroheight design system awards recently. Like, super proud of that team. One of the things that they did really well in their process is they kind of used a similar approach, which was like, we're going to make things that are really specific. And they would ask the implementing teams about how much time do you think that saved you? And they would get answers like, about a week of work. And then that phrase, they would immediately put in a deck and share it around. Like, as soon as they got that phrase from a usability test, they would share it around. And so every conversation they would lead with, hey, we saved teams about a week. Like, we worked on this for 2 weeks, and then we saved teams about a week. We saved 4 teams about a week. So that's about 4 weeks that we just saved real quick. And so even before describing what the approach was, like, they got in front of the story and said, this is what we did. This is the outcome that we achieved. Don't worry about how we achieved it yet. And most stakeholders actually didn't ask about that. They were just like, oh, you saved 4 teams a week? That's awesome. Can you do more of that stuff? And they were like, sure, we'll do more of that. And it was like, they didn't even let anyone get to the part of the story of like, wait a sec, well, how did you do that? And what I learned from that is, a lot of times people ask questions about the details when things are broken, not necessarily when things are working. When things are working fine, everybody's like, yeah, cool. When something's broken, it's like, if your car breaks down, you're like, is it the carburetor, or is it the spark plugs, or is it this, or if your car's working fine, you're not like, what's happening under the hood? You don't care because your car's running fine. So I thought that team did a really good job of kind of solving that and getting ahead of the story. As soon as they got that, it wasn't like a metric that they got from a dashboard somewhere, or it wasn't like a very, very quantitative. It was, as soon as one person said about a week, they put the phrase about a week in all of the decks about that and started sharing that out immediately.
That's a great example, Dan. I love that. Kevin, what's going on, man?
Honestly, I just wanted to call out Amy and a wonderful thing that she said, and it's just aligned to how I feel. And this is a weird, gig, design systems. It's not really weird, it's risky. It's probably one of the more risky professions you could possibly do. But what Amy said, it really resonated with me, is that, well, listen, if I can't do what you hired me to do, why am I here? Mm-hmm. And then I also had to be, very sympathetic to, let's say I work in government, or I work in healthcare, and we have very strict things. We're going to wait, 3, 6, 24 weeks for a very simple thing to be stood up. And of course, I brazenly said, yeah, I'll just stand it up right now. Of course, I'll get fired. And but that's the risk. That's the rascaliness of us, is that we would risk, being relieved of our duties and paycheck to affect change. So I would probably suggest that that never works out. No one is happy with that. It probably is not something that I could not do, but it's not something that maybe in a long-term situation in certain industries would be successful. And that's all I really wanted to mention there.
Yeah. Dan, do you have a response to that, or?
Staten first. I'll go after.
Okay. Yeah.
One, to like the flexibility of design systems, right? So the organization that I'm currently in is very developer heavy, strong autonomy given to the developers. And coming into the organization, all of these developers know the product in the different areas within the product way more than I ever did. So we kind of adopted this hybrid model of the design system team, and calling it a team is a bit of a misnomer because there's only dedicated 2 of us, where we've kind of taken on more of a role of like a librarian, right? Where we're not actually like writing the articles or the books, right? We're leaving it up to our users, our developers and our designers to go through and actually define the patterns and the components that are needed. And then we just kind of make sure the documentation makes sense. We put it in a place where people can find it again. And then when there's questions asked, we try to like direct people the best that we can. If it's to a specific component page or a documentation area, share links, or we connect them to the person who might know the area best, right? So as like a design system team, we're not really like dictating how people should be building our UI. We're kind of letting our users best, lead by lead by example there. And to kind of what Dan was talking about with like really tightening down use cases, a real use case that we came up with within our system is I came in, I started noticing that our tooltips had interactive links within them. And that's typically like a hard pattern to go through because you're hovering over something, and if you move your mouse, the tooltip goes away. So we actually tightened up the scope of that to not allow interactive elements within it. And by scoping down the use cases of that specific component, created this usage gap where another component actually was created called a toggle tip. Carbon's IBM design system uses this similar thing where you literally have to click a thing and show it up, and then you can put all kinds of interactive elements in there because it's going to stay on screen. And since we like tightened down the usage of that tooltip, this toggle tip usage has like skyrocketed, and it's starting to pop up all over the product. And I think that's a great story to tell based on like how tightening things down and defining more proper use cases can actually show where you're not fully covered in other components and stuff like that.
Love that. Dan, what's up?
A quick thing. I know Kevin had to drop. I appreciate Kevin's comment and shouting out Amy's comment as well. I think those are super important questions to ask about, like, why am I here? One of the things that, and part of the reason that I'm so glad we're having this conversation and why I like having this conversation about how much of a rascal are you, is that a lot of times the response from people that I've seen, that I've worked with, is I can't afford to be a rascal. And a lot of people are afraid of the answer of that question. Like, that's why they don't ask it. Why am I here? What did you hire me to do? Because I think they're afraid that the answer is, oh, you're right. I actually don't have a reason for you to be here. In that case, and we fear what comes after that, what comes at the end of that. And I think that's a real risk that I'm seeing with a lot of the teams I'm working with right now. A lot of organizational trauma, a lot of not knowing the answer to that question and just kind of wanting to fly under the radar so that people will not notice that they actually don't have a reason for you being here. And yeah, maybe we should rethink your position or this design system thing, or, whatever the thing is. Yeah, maybe we should defund that and actually distribute it. And it potentially has a lot more ramifications than that. And I think that's what I've seen create a lot of anxiety for people, right? Anxiety is fear about the future. And so I've seen a lot of that be like, create anxiety because of it. And I think that's why it's important that we're having this conversation. So thank you all for all of your comments on it.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, that's actually a really good way to wrap up. I do just want to recognize there are always comments in our answers that are sort of folks bearing their souls about some of the real struggles they're actually dealing with. So I just want you all to know you're not alone in this, right? There's a lot of people out there like the folks on this call that are willing to talk and chat about this stuff. So I saw those answers too. So I just don't want you to feel like we didn't read your comments. There is a link to Dan's book. As you can tell, Dan's got so much insight and experience. Amy's got it up on screen. I love it. So get a copy of that. And just, Dan, thank you so much for being here, for sharing an hour of your day with us. It means a lot. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all for being here. Ben, thank you for inviting me. This is a fantastic conversation. Thank you all.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again to our sponsors, Zeroheight and Sparkbox, for making this episode possible. And thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to participate live in future episodes of The Question, visit bencallahan.com/thequestion. And as always, stay in learning mode.